Alright, so I'm going to go over the Charadriiformes tag real quick. Charadriiformes are shorebirds, and so we have several different families of shorebirds within the Charadriiformes tag that we'll take a look at some examples of. The first family is Burhinidae. These are the thick knees. They're called that because, as you'll see, they have what appears to be thick-looking knees. Um, And so, our first species, actually, I think the only species of thick knee in the tag, is the spotted dickhawk, which is also called the spotted thick knee, Burrhinus capensis. It's a species of least concern and that eats insects, small inverts, and small amphibians. You'll see a lot of these shorebirds, though not all of them, have long legs like this guy does, and that's because many of them at some point wade around in the water, and so that as they're like stilts to walk around in the water with. Um, though this species in particular has somewhat long legs, but is not really strongly associated with water. It's actually a species of uh, more like open woodlands and grasslands, which I guess I'm going to talk about right now. So, there are four subspecies recognized by the birds of the world of the spotted thickney. Is found in Saudi Arabia and then basically in all of sub-Saharan Africa except for Sierra Leone, Liberia, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon. Though some of those some of those countries are less well, I guess, distributionally represented than others. Or some of those countries, the distribution is fairly the bird's fairly scarce. I guess is a good way to say it. Um, Again, so it's a species of arid open woodlands and savannas, and within certain parts of its range can be found up to almost 2,500 meters elevation, and it is a non-migratory sedentary species. Our next family is Recurvorostridae. These are stilts and avocets. And when I talk about walking on stilts, this is such a great example of a wading bird walking on stilts. Very, very cool. Um, and here you can really see if you've looked at the anatomy section already, and we talked about legs, you can really see uh, something interesting here. We discussed in that section the idea of a knee. So we were just talking about the idea of a knee with the spotted thick knees, and the you can't see the knee in this picture. You can't. The spotted dickhawk picture is not that easy to see, anyways, because of the grasses. Here it's very clear. Uh, that's not a knee. In case that wasn't very clear from the anatomy lecture, that bend is the ankle, and that long, long, long bit of the bird here is its tarsus, um, tarsametatarsus. It's its tarsus. It's its foot. It's a fusion of tarsal bones. And as we talked about in that lecture, the foot is digitigrade. So these guys are using these long feet like stilts and walking on their toes through the water is what they're doing. The knee is up here, um, where you have this very short femur, a knee, uh, long tibia, tibia tarsus, and fibula, and then this very long tarsametatarsus, the foot. So this is such a really good real example, and it's not a diagram. It's an actual bird, and it shows actually an incredible adaptation and a very elongate tarsus for wading in the water. So the black-necked stilt is Hymantopus mexicanus. It is a species of least concern. Feeds on aquatic invertebrates and also very small fish, but its diet is mostly aquatic invertebrates. There are three subspecies ranging north from Alberta and Saskatchewan, so way up here, south to Argentina and Chile, with a very prominent gap in South America in the distribution of these three subspecies. Is a species of water edge or shallow wetlands, and there is migration in this species, but is population specific migration. So it's not a complete migration of all individuals. It's not like that, but certain populations are migratory within the great range that this species covers. Um, Taxonomy, subspecies level taxonomy is a little tricky in this group because it is probable that some of the subspecies, if not all the subspecies, at some point will be elevated to species status. There's at least a reasonable chance of that, and so that's just something to consider. And I don't know, 10 years from now, you might be looking at blackneck stilt and see a much smaller range, and there'll be, a couple other species of stilt that will take up the rest of the range on the range map. This is something to think about. Charadriiformes are the plovers and lapwings. And so we have a really cool uh, species, the masked lapwing. It has this neat yellow mask. Vanilla Smiles. I think its name sounds like the name of a saxophone player, Vanilla Smiles. I don't know. The scientific name cracks me up. It's another species of least concern, as most of the species in the tag for this group are. Um, its diet is mostly insects, worms, and spiders, but it does consume various other invertebrates. It consumes some amount of seeds and leaf material as well. And its distribution is New Guinea, Australia, Tasmania, and New Zealand. And there are two subspecies within that range. Um, Primarily a species of either short grasses that could include, it could literally include like a city park, anywhere where there's very short grasses, um, but also of wetlands, and is found in coastal areas, and is a sedentary species that is nomadic, and meaning the one subspecies, the blackback subspecies. I know we didn't go into the two subspecies, but the blackback subspecies in particular will move with food. It's a little more wetland centric, let's say, and so when wetlands, as they dry up, that blackback subspecies moves to new and different locations to stay in moist wetlands where it can forage. Scolopacity are the sandpipers and their allies. We have one species, a particularly cool species of Scolopacid, that is the ruff, which is just an incredible, striking bird. Calidris pugnax, species of least concern. Diets primarily insects and other invertebrates. Uh, this is a lekking species, and when we get to reproduction, you'll get to read about lekking, but it's a really cool reproductive behavior that this species does. They uh, they breed in basically northern Europe and across most of Russia, and then they winter in most of sub-Saharan Africa, and then um, along the coast. So basically, um, along the coast of these seas, and I've listed all the seas here: Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, the Java Sea, the South China Sea, and the Philippine Sea are the seas that those coasts are associated with. So those are the primary regions. I have excluded a little bit of of the wintering range from this description, just for, well, it was taking up a lot of space to write all that out on one slide. Uh, and they breed in coastal tundra, forest near wetlands, and then they winter in dry plains, grasslands, or wetlands in Africa. So, well, Africa and all the rest of that wintering range that I just mentioned. So that's our Scolopacid. Alcids, we have auks, murres, and puffins. We have 4 species in the tag here, including our 3 puffins and the common murre. So the only species in this tag that you could visually confuse with any other are 2 of the puffins, and we'll get to those here in a second. The first is quite distinct. The tufted puffin has these long head tufts that you see here. It gives it sort of distinguished eyebrows, I guess. Furticula serrata is a species of least concern, and about 50 to 70% of the diet for this species is invertebrate, and the rest is fish. The young of this species are fed primarily fish. It is a species of the North Pacific, and can be found breeding in California, Oregon, Washington, the Gulf of Alaska, the Aleutians, Japan, and Russia. In outside of breeding range, it can be found out on open ocean throughout the North Pacific. But during the breeding season, it breeds on rocky islands and along mainland cliffs. And any actual migration that's occurring is often going to be driven by ice. This is really true for all of the puffins. Um, they may move out of a given range as ice moves in. Basically, the ice itself, you have no open water to be on if it's covered in ice, and that doesn't work for them, so they have to move. So that's the tufted puffin. The next 2 species are visually very similar, but if you look at the beak and then you compare the Atlantic puffin's beak to our next puffin that we're going to look at, you'll see the beaks are a pretty easy giveaway for these species. Furticula arctica is the Atlantic puffin. It is a vulnerable species, so it's one of the only couple of species in this tag where we have to worry about conservation issues. Vulnerable due to hunting and egg collection, particularly historic hunting. It is still hunted in certain parts of its range where that's legal. Iceland and the Faroe Island region, these are still hunted, so it's a problem there. In colonies of Atlantic puffins in Britain, there are problems with Norway rats. And in general, a problem for these guys is the collapse of Atlantic fish stocks, because that's what they eat. They primarily eat schooling fish. They also eat some crustaceans and marine worms, but their primary diet's schooling fish, and they compete with us for those fish. There are also some problems, though the magnitude of the problems are a little hard to measure. But some problems with just human disturbance in general during the breeding season. And so the breeding range of the 3 Atlantic puffin subspecies is basically the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Barents Sea. So Barents Sea ends up here. So basically between 43 degrees north and 80 degrees north latitude. These guys breed on grassy maritime slopes, as well as cliffs and boulder fields. In terms of movement, they show a strong fidelity to breeding site and wintering home range. In other words, they tend to return to the same general wintering ranges and same general breeding ranges each year. And their migration is, as I mentioned earlier, when it happens, it's not a complete migration and it is based primarily on ice. And here's the horned puffin. And so when you initially see this, you might go, my gosh, the horned puffin looks so much like the Atlantic puffin. And in some respects, it does. But look at the beak. Look at the large band of yellow at the base of the beak. And then if you look at this guy, you see that the Atlantic puffin doesn't have that. So that in and of itself, that feature of the beak should be enough to get you there. So the horned puffins, Patricula corniculate. I think it's corniculata, not corniculate. I'll have to make sure. It should be corniculate. No, it is corniculate. It's corniculate. Um, is a species of least concern. Uh, consumes small schooling fish, pretty typical and expected. Uh, Particularly in the non-breeding season, it tends to eat more squid and lanternfish. And the horned puffin's range is kind of similar to the tufted puffin's range. It's a North Pacific species, primarily in the Gulf of Alaska, Aleutians, and Russia. You see it doesn't breed nearly as far south, like it doesn't have any breeding range in the Pacific United States, along like Washington, Oregon, and California, whereas the tufted puffin does. So its distribution is actually different, particularly in terms of breeding range, but there's quite a bit of overlap there and where you find them. And these guys breed on rock islands and cliffs throughout their range. Their again movements are very similar. All the puffins sort of do some of the same things in terms of they have their breeding ranges that they breed in, and then they move out into more open waters in the winter time, and they will migrate if ice becomes an issue. Common murre, Uriah algae, is a species of least concern that eats fish, krill, copepods, and squid. And this is another species where, while the adult diet is quite varied, it primarily feeds the young fish. So with the alcids, I think that's I don't want to say universally true. I don't know if that's the case, but at least it's broadly true that the diet is more fish focused. In its distribution, there are 4 subspecies that range anywhere from 34 to 70 degrees north, and this is a circumpolar distribution. Um, their migration depends on latitude and it's driven by ice actually. Higher latitude species just are forced to migrate due to ice, and whereas at medium latitudes some species may be forced to migrate, many will not. And then at low latitudes the species are unlikely to do any movement other than maybe moving for food scarcity purposes, but I don't think that's as big of an issue for the common murre. Um, they show very high breeding site fidelity. They tend to return to the same breeding sites every year, and they breed on cliffs um, near the sea where prey get concentrated by ocean currents. So those are our alcids, and then we have 2 larids, and that finishes this group. It's not a very big group. Um, Larids are gulls and terns, things like that. And that's what we have an example of here. We have the gray gull, and then we'll have an Inca tern to finish out this group. So the gray gull And I say, AKA gray gull. And it's like, why the heck is that there? Well, you have the British and the English spelling. And while the tag uses the British spelling, and to be quite honest, I actually prefer that, birds of the world and English authorities will use the English spelling with the A in gray instead of the E. So you have to be aware if you go to Birds of the World or something like that and type in gray gull with an E instead of an A, it might like not come up for you. And it thinks you don't know how to spell, but really you're just using the British spelling of gray. Um, so this is Leucophaeus modestus, is a species of least concern. They eat a lot of mole crabs, and sometimes they exclusively focus on and consumption of mole crabs. Though they will also eat Peruvian anchovy and sardines, so small fish, and nereid worms, which are just marine polychaete worms. The gray gull is a Pacific coast of South America species, which can be found from central Ecuador all the way south to more or less central Chile. It has a very interesting uh, breeding story going on. Its breeding populations are really poorly understood. These species during the breeding season will be seen at the beach, but no one ever sees their nests. And they don't breed on the beach. That's why. They breed in the desert. They breed out in harsh desert and salt flat areas. Um, and they actually they utilize at least it's thought that the reason they utilize these deserts that are relatively close to the coast, like something like within 40 kilometers or so of the coast, is that the deserts are a very harsh environment that most predators don't really hang out in. It's a very low predator density. And so because of that, they're very safe to breed in those areas. Um, Obviously comes at a cost of their food is at the beach and their nests are in the desert. So they have to constantly be flying to the ocean, getting food, bringing it back to feed the young. Um, but it must have some significant payoff and predator avoidance. Most of their colonies aren't known. In other words, there are far more birds that must be breeding than there are colonies accounted for. And so I think there's probably going to be, as folks research this species more and work on this species more, there's probably going to be some more interesting discoveries in terms of where these breeding colonies actually lie, how far they have to travel for food, and the strategies they've taken for breeding. It's a really cool species, and if I lived in, I don't know, South America, Pacific coastal South America, I think it's a species that I would try to study because it's really neat. Um, yeah, and so their habitat, of course, then is coast and desert. The Inca tern, Lerostarna inca, is a near-threatened species. Its conservation status, the information on the conservation status is kind of interesting. So, in El Nino years, the species sort of vanishes from its normal range, which you'll see is really similar to the range of the gray gull, almost identical. Um, and so some people thought historically that the birds suffered or starved to death or something happened to the populations in El Nino years and then they rebounded. But what seems to be more likely the case from the evidence that exists is that they emigrate in El Nino years and then return to their normal habitat, um, their normal range in non El Nino years. And that's pretty cool because I don't think anyone has figured out yet exactly where they go uh, outside of or inside of an El Nino year. Another threat to them is overfishing of Peruvian anchoveta, which is uh, one of their major dietary components in the wild. Though they also do eat planktonic crustaceans. And so there you can see again you're you're almost the same distribution as the gray gull, Pacific coast of South America, not quite Ecuador, but getting close to Ecuador, basically from um, most all of Peru through Chile. Um, these guys are strongly associated with guano islands. Really interesting. Guano islands, if you don't know about guano islands, look them up. They're islands where there are just so many shorebirds that the guano, the excrement, uh, bird poop, it builds up on the islands, and you get these thick beds of feces. And that makes a very excellent fertilizer. As a small aside, it's humorous. If you've ever watched Ace Ventura 2, the Jim Carrey comedy film from my childhood, uh, the entire motivation of the villain in that film is the acquisition of bat guano. So is this uh, to be used as fertilizer because it's worth a lot of money. Um, the United States actually has claim to some of these guano islands off the coast of South America because in the 19th century we would go there and harvest the guano as fertilizer. Now, the nature of that has changed quite a bit over time. We make a lot of uh, synthetically produced, artificially produced fertilizers now. But in the 19th century, this was an incredibly important resource for fertilizer. Anyways, the Inca terns are associated strongly with these guano islands. Um, and generally, they don't migrate. They are sedentary, but they do follow food. So when there are seasonal shifts in food availability, they will move with food. So that is a Charadriiformes tag. And as always, if you have any questions, reach out.